In the late spring of 1940, the continent didn't just fall, it collapsed. In a matter of weeks, the Iron Reich swept aside the Vistula defenses, erased the lowland corridor, and shattered the armies of the West. The Republic of Gallia, confident behind its concrete fortresses, disintegrated in just over a month. Along the northern coast, the Albion Expeditionary Force fled through smoke and fire from the beaches of Port Azure, leaving behind tanks, guns, and the illusion that the war could be contained. To the world watching from across the oceans, it looked finished. One power now ruled the mainland from the Arctic harbors of Nordvik to the sunlit ports of Iberon. No rival army could challenge it on land. No alliance could match its momentum. And yet, 5 years later, its capital lay crushed under rubble, its armies dissolved into columns of prisoners, its leaders either dead, missing, or hunted. The nation itself was carved into zones and occupied by its enemies. That kind of collapse doesn't come from fate. It doesn't come from courage on the other side, and it doesn't come from a single lost battle. It comes from something far more dangerous. A chain of decisions so catastrophically flawed that defeat becomes unavoidable long before the final shot is fired. What happened between triumph and annihilation was not chance, but a slow, methodical act of self-destruction. Between 1940 and 1945, the High Command of the Iron Reich committed a sequence of strategic errors, each one narrowing its options, each one amplifying the damage of the next, until by the third year of the war, the outcome was no longer a question of if, but when. Today, I'm going to show you how the most feared military system ever assembled dismantled itself without realizing it, not through heroic last stands or overwhelming enemy brilliance, but through 10 interconnected blunders that made victory mathematically impossible. And before we go any further, you need to understand this. None of these mistakes existed in isolation. Every bad choice created the conditions for the next one. Every delay hardened the enemy's resolve. By the time the Reich realized the trap it had built for itself, escape was no longer an option. Which raises the real question that still haunts military historians today. Was defeat inevitable? Or did the war hinge on a single moment where history could have bent the other way? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, the answer will challenge everything you think you know about power, momentum, and winning wars. But to understand the collapse, we have to begin at the exact moment when total victory was still possible. Early summer, 1940. Gallia has surrendered. Albion stands alone. The Reich controls the coastline of an entire continent. Its ground forces are unmatched. Its air arm, the Storm Wing, outnumbers the island's defenders on paper, but paper hides a deadly truth. Reich fighters can only linger above Albion's skies for minutes before fuel forces them home, while island factories replace lost aircraft faster than the bombers can destroy them. This is the crossroads. This is the window. And this is where the first and greatest opportunity slips away. The invasion plan, codenamed Tidebreaker, is authorized in mid-July. The timetable is aggressive, the confidence absolute, but the requirements are unforgiving. Command of the air, control of the narrow seas, and coastal artillery dominance over the straits. The Reich achieves none of them. The Storm Wing launches massive raids against island airfields, attempting to shatter the defenders on the ground, but instead of collapsing, the island's resistance hardens. Pilots rotate, radar adapts, production accelerates, and with every passing week, the balance quietly shifts. By late summer, the air war above the island had changed character. New aircraft were arriving from across the Atlantic. Volunteer pilots from the shattered nations of the East, men who had already lost their homelands, filled the cockpits and refused to yield the skies. Squadrons from the Commonwealth rotated in, bringing experience, discipline, and desperation. By September, the Storm Wing had burned through its strength without breaking the island's defenses. Air superiority was not achieved, and without it, the invasion clock stopped. First, the landing date slipped. Then it slipped again. And then, Without ever admitting failure, the High Command quietly abandoned the idea altogether. The operation was never officially cancelled, but everyone involved understood the truth. The Reich had blinked. And here is the part most people miss. The failure wasn't that the invasion was attempted and repelled. The failure was that the Reich never truly knew how to invade at all. Its military system was fractured at the core. The ground forces envisioned a narrow thrust. The air arm imagined the enemy collapsing from terror, alone. The fleet, such as it was, knew none of this could work. The Reich Navy was built to guard coastlines and harass shipping, not to project power across open water. It had no doctrine for amphibious war, no landing craft, no logistical spine. The invasion fleet was a desperate improvisation. River barges lashed together, tugboats repurposed for ocean crossings, merchant hulls never designed for combat. Each branch planned its own version of victory. None of them spoke the same operational language. Coordination was an illusion. Training was inadequate. The entire enterprise rested on hope rather than capability. And because of that failure, the island survived. That single fact sealed the Reich's fate. Because every month the island remained undefeated, 3 irreversible processes accelerated. Supplies from across the ocean increased in volume and sophistication. Industrial output expanded beyond pre-war limits. And most critically, the island transformed into an unsinkable forward base, a dagger pointed permanently at the continent. Years later, when the Western invasion finally came, it launched from those same harbors. When heavy bombers reduced continental cities to ash, they lifted from those same runways. When the Reich was forced to garrison the coast, stretch its manpower, and bleed itself dry defending territory it could never fully secure, it was because that island had never fallen. But in the summer of triumph, none of this registered. Because even as one war remained unfinished, the leadership turned east, toward a decision so reckless it would eclipse every mistake that came before it. The order was issued in secrecy. The name was Dawn Strike. The target was the largest land mass on Earth. And on the morning of June 22nd, 1941, at precisely 3:15, more than 3 million soldiers crossed the frontier in the greatest invasion ever attempted by human beings. The confidence was absolute. Internal estimates predicted collapse within 2 months. The Supreme Leader himself dismissed the campaign as a matter of forceful entry. "Kick in the door," he said, "and the whole structure would fall." It didn't. It didn't bend. It didn't fracture. It absorbed the blow and responded. And this is where the disaster becomes more than military. This was ideology masquerading as strategy. The invasion plan reveals it in plain numbers. Intelligence officers correctly identified that the eastern state possessed enormous manpower reserves, but catastrophically misjudged their scale and speed. The estimate was 2 million replacements over half a year. Reality delivered twice that number in barely over a week. Logistics officers raised alarms even before the first shot was fired. Supply lines, they warned, could not sustain operations beyond a few hundred miles. The capital lay more than 600 miles inland. The math did not work. The maps did not work. The fuel calculations did not work. And then the Reich crossed a line that even its enemies didn't expect. On its own initiative, it declared war on the Atlantic Republic. Many people assumed this was automatic, that the Eastern Empire's strike across the Pacific forced the Reich's hand. It did not. There was no legal obligation, no military necessity, and understanding why exposes one of the most catastrophic intelligence blind spots of the entire war. On the 7th day of December, 1941, the Rising Sun Empire struck the Pacific Fleet at Harbor Red. The Atlantic Republic responded the following day, declaring war on its attacker. The alliance binding the Reich to the Eastern Empire was defensive by design. Its language was explicit. Assistance was required only if a member was attacked. In this case, the Eastern Empire had fired first. The Reich had a clean exit. 4 days later, it chose annihilation instead. On December 11th, the Reich formally declared war on a nation it could not physically reach. And this decision defies every rational strategic framework ever written. The Atlantic Republic possessed the largest industrial base on Earth, an economy capable of manufacturing ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons at a scale no other power could match. The Reich had no transoceanic fleet, no long-range bomber force, no capacity to land soldiers on another continent. It could not threaten the Atlantic Republic in any meaningful way. But the reverse was not true. Atlantic bombers could reach the Reich's cities. Atlantic shipyards could flood the seas with escorts and transports. Atlantic soldiers could cross the ocean and fight on continental soil. The asymmetry was absolute. So why do it? Because the Reich's leadership was operating with incomplete reality. 9 months earlier, while diplomats spoke politely and newspapers promised neutrality, something else was happening behind closed doors. In the spring of 1941, senior military planners from the island nation and the Atlantic Republic met in secrecy in the capital of the Republic. The sessions were codenamed North Star. Their conclusion was chillingly simple. If the Republic entered the war, its primary objective would not be the Pacific. It would be the destruction of the Reich. Europe first, everything else secondary. Industrial output, troop deployments, strategic bombing, amphibious planning, all oriented toward crushing the Reich's war machine. This was not theory. It was a signed operational framework. When the Reich declared war in December, it didn't just add a new enemy. It triggered a fully prepared execution plan designed specifically for its elimination. Within hours, the Republic's legislature convened. The vote to declare war passed unanimously in both chambers. Not a single dissenting voice. The declaration accomplished what years of debate could not. It unified an entire industrial civilization overnight. And now the Reich faced the impossible. The island to the west, the continental colossus to the east, and the world's greatest factory to the far side of the ocean. But even as this strategic noose tightened, something even more devastating was unfolding far from the front lines, beyond the maps the Reich's generals obsessed over. Deep inside the Eastern Empire, a process began that Reich intelligence had dismissed as fantasy. Because this is the part most histories mention only in passing, despite the fact that it decided the war before any final battle was fought. In the summer of the invasion year, as armored columns drove eastward, the eastern state began dismantling its own industrial heart. Not evacuating people, not salvaging equipment, dismantling entire production ecosystems. Factories were taken apart bolt by bolt, machine tools crated, power systems disassembled, blueprints archived. Engineers, technicians, and laborers moved with their machines. Rail lines filled with convoys heading eastward, away from the front, beyond the reach of enemy bombers. By the second year of the Eastern War, the numbers no longer lied. Reich armored units were knocking out enemy vehicles at a terrifying rate, yet somehow the enemy had more tanks every month than the month before. Losses that should have been decisive simply vanished into replacement columns. What the Reich failed to grasp, but Atlantic intelligence quietly documented, was that this wasn't improvisation. It was preparation. In the final months before the invasion, observers stationed in the eastern capital noticed something profoundly unsettling. Heavy machinery rolling east on rail cars. Entire teams of skilled workers reassigned beyond the horizon. Production lines disappearing before a single shot had been fired. The Eastern leadership knew the strike was coming and acted accordingly. By the time the invasion began, the Reich wasn't fighting an unprepared giant. It was fighting a state that had already shifted its industrial heart out of reach. And now the imbalance was complete. An enemy with greater production, deeper manpower reserves, and a growing ability to absorb punishment. But wars are not won by factories alone. They are decided by leadership, by doctrine, by the quality of command under pressure. And this is where the Reich committed its next fatal error. The very system that had made its early victories possible was systematically dismantled from within. For decades, the Reich's army had relied on mission command, a philosophy built on trust. Officers were given intent, not instructions. Subordinates were expected to adapt, improvise, and exploit opportunity without waiting for permission. It was flexible, it was fast, and it was devastating. By 1942, it no longer existed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened through interference. Orders began coming directly from the top, bypassing experienced commanders. Tactical decisions were replaced by ideological demands. The map became more important than the reality on the ground. That summer, forces were ordered south toward the oil regions while simultaneously driving east toward the great river city of Volgograd. Veteran officers protested. Splitting strength during an offensive violated every principle they had been trained to follow. The response was final. Do it anyway. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. The previous winter, as temperatures collapsed and engines froze solid, frontline commanders requested permission to withdraw to defensible ground, shorten supply lines, and preserve combat power. The answer was absolute refusal. No movement, no retreat. Positions with no operational value became graves. Men froze standing guard over frozen fields. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were defeated, but because they were forbidden to move. This was no longer warfare. It was punishment by decree. And here is the bitter irony. The Eastern enemy began the war making the exact same mistakes. Its leadership initially strangled its own command structure, forbidding withdrawals, sacrificing armies for political symbolism. The losses were horrifying. But unlike the Reich, the Eastern leadership learned. By the third year, authority shifted downward. Experienced commanders were empowered. Operational planning became disciplined, methodical, ruthless. While the Reich's system hardened into dogma, the enemy's system evolved into competence. The two curves crossed. From that moment on, the outcome became only a matter of scale, and nowhere was this transformation more visible than at Volgograd. By late summer 1942, Reich forces reached the city on the Great River. Its name carried immense symbolic weight. Taking it would humiliate the enemy leadership. But symbol is not strategy. The true objective lay further south. In the oil-bearing regions, the Reich's economy desperately needed to survive. Instead of bypassing the city, forces were drawn inward. Streets replaced maneuver. Buildings replaced open terrain. The fight became vertical, subterranean, room by room. Tanks lost their advantage. Aircraft became irrelevant. Months passed. Mid-November 1942. While the ruins of Volgograd consumed attention and lives, the real blow fell elsewhere. The Eastern Command unleashed a counterstroke codenamed Iron Ring, not aimed at the city itself, but at the fragile edges holding the entire operation together. Along the northern and southern flanks stood Allied formations from the Danubian and Alpine states, brave but poorly equipped, stretched thin across open steppe, lacking armor, lacking reserves, lacking hope. The assault hit like a hammer. Armored spearheads punched through frozen ground, bypassing resistance, driving deep into the rear areas. Within days, those columns met west of the city, sealing the encirclement with brutal precision. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers vanished into a shrinking pocket. And it was in those hours, between the 23rd and 24th of November, that the disaster crossed the point of no return. The field commander transmitted desperate assessments to headquarters. The message was unambiguous. Break out now. The corridor is still open. Delay means annihilation. The answer that returned was not military. It was ideological. Hold the city. Supply will come from the air. The promise came from the highest uniformed authority in the Reich's air arm, who assured the leadership that transport aircraft could deliver 1,000 tons of supplies every day. The reality was merciless. The trapped force required far more simply to exist. What arrived instead was a fraction, barely enough to delay starvation. Winter closed in, engines froze, ammunition dwindled, wounds went untreated. Hunger hollowed entire divisions. By the new year, the pocket had become a grave. When the final assault came, resistance collapsed not from cowardice, but from physical impossibility. On the second day of February, the remaining survivors surrendered. 91,000 men walked into captivity. Fewer than 1 in 20 would ever see home again. The scale of the catastrophe defies easy comparison. Hundreds of thousands of Axis casualties, entire formations erased, the ground itself choked with bodies. And yet, the Eastern Command absorbed even greater losses and continued forward. That was the difference. One side could replace armies, the other could not. And the tragedy of Volgograd was not that it happened once. It was that the lesson was never learned. The doctrine that destroyed that army became policy. Hold ground at all costs. No withdrawals, no flexibility. Over the next year, this order reproduced disaster after disaster. Pockets formed like wounds across the map. Entire corpses of armies trapped and consumed. Winter 1944. A large formation surrounded near the river Kherson. 60,000 men gone. Earlier, similar fates at Deepwood, Iron Gate, and dozens of lesser-known cauldrons erased combat power faster than it could be rebuilt. Each time the response was the same: stand fast. Each time the enemy simply waited, encircled and crushed. And here lies the cruel irony. This obsession with holding ground was born from a single success. Early in 1942, a trapped force of roughly 100,000 had survived an encirclement thanks to a narrow air supply effort and eventual breakout. That success hardened into dogma. What was never acknowledged was scale. The earlier pocket was smaller, the distance shorter, the weather survivable, the enemy weaker. By the time the same logic was applied again, none of those conditions existed. But precedent overruled analysis. Faith replaced math. And so, entire armies vanished. Meanwhile, the Reich was bleeding everywhere at once. Divisions were tied down in the southern peninsula. Garrisons stretched across the western coast. Forces locked in the mountains and fjords of the north. Security units bogged down in partisan warfare across occupied lands. Manpower drained away defending territory that no longer mattered strategically. The Reich was fighting a global war with a continental army, dispersing strength while its enemies concentrated theirs. When a state spreads its strength across every frontier, it guarantees that no frontier will be strong enough. By the summer of 1944, the Reich had reached that breaking point. Its forces were scattered across a collapsing empire. Dozens of divisions stood along the western coast. Far more bled on the endless plains of the east. Others were trapped in the mountains of the south, while garrisons sat idle in frozen northern ports and restless occupied territories. None of these forces could meaningfully reinforce one another. Distance, destroyed rail networks, fuel shortages, and constant air attack made rapid concentration impossible. Meanwhile, the enemy had a luxury the Reich no longer possessed: choice. The Allies could decide where to strike. The Reich could only guess, and it guessed wrong. In the east, High Command became convinced that the main summer blow would fall in the south, toward the oil regions and the approaches to Central Europe. To prepare for this imagined threat, combat power was stripped from the central sector, artillery units redeployed, anti-tank assets shifted away, armored formations reassigned. The Central Army Group, already stretched thin, was hollowed out from within. On June 22nd, exactly 3 years after the invasion that had begun the Eastern War, the counterstroke came. The Eastern Command launched Operation Thunderfall. It did not seek a breakthrough. It sought annihilation. Multiple fronts attacked simultaneously, overwhelming weak points, isolating formations, collapsing command structures. Entire corps ceased to exist in a matter of weeks. The scale of destruction surpassed even the catastrophe on the great river city. An entire army group was erased. Roads filled with prisoners. Equipment littered the countryside. The Reich never recovered. From that moment on, the war was no longer about holding territory. It was about delaying the inevitable. Industrial output lagged further behind. Manpower pools dried up. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Bombers darkened the skies daily. Faced with this reality, the leadership turned away from strategy and toward fantasy. If conventional war could not be won, then something extraordinary must save them. A miracle, a weapon that would rewrite the rules. Enormous resources were diverted into projects that promised salvation through technology. Jet fighters that flew faster than anything in the sky. Rockets that crossed borders without warning. Heavily armored vehicles that looked unstoppable on paper. Some of these designs were genuinely groundbreaking, but they arrived too late, in too few numbers, and at a cost the Reich could no longer afford. The first jet fighters stunned their enemies, ripping through bomber formations with ease. Yet for all their brilliance, they were crippled by fragile engines, scarce materials, and constant bombardment of production facilities. Most never left the ground. Others flew a handful of missions before being grounded forever. The rocket campaign terrified civilians but changed nothing on the battlefield. It consumed resources equivalent to entire air fleets and delivered no strategic return. What the Reich needed was not wonder. It needed volume. Fighters that could be built by the thousands. Tanks that could be repaired in the field. Fuel that could keep armies moving. Instead, it chose spectacle over sustainability, and by the final year of the war, the pattern was complete. Every early advantage had been squandered, every rational warning ignored, every successful lesson misapplied. The enemy learned, adapted, and concentrated. The Reich improvised, rigidified, and dispersed. What began as unstoppable momentum ended as strategic paralysis. The collapse of the Reich was not the result of one battle, one enemy, or one unlucky turn. It was the result of interconnected decisions, each one narrowing options, each one compounding the damage of the last. Victory was possible in 1940. Survival was possible in 1941. Containment was possible in 1942. After that, only defeat remained.